Yeah. Well, and I think I can just print out the schedule and circle the ones I want to. I don't think yeah, it's a big deal.
You started coming over my speaker.
I did?
That was weird. How did that happen? To get into tap dancing recently.
Hey, everybody. We are in the home stretch, so we just have another hour here. So again, just a reminder about your CEUs. If you need CEUs, it's through this link with the QR code. There have been some people that have said they're having a little trouble with it. So if you have trouble, just see me. We'll get it straightened out for you. With that, I'm going to introduce TJ. How do you say your last name? TJ Ely with Plante Moran. So he's going to take us through some of the fascinating reimbursement rates. So I know we all, the last session of the day, we're all excited about that, right?
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm TJ. Those looking for Denise, she is under the weather, so of course didn't want to make the trip down. So I will hopefully entertain you guys for the next hour. Volume okay? Next slide. Clicker is not working. You can go one more. So we'll talk about a few different things today. The first is what's going on with the fiscal year 22 and 23 rates, specifically as it relates to HB 110 and the different factors and nuances at play here over the next few years. And then we'll go into, OPRA had asked us to go through some examples of specific ICF rate calculations and the methodologies. And then lastly, some data trends that we're seeing updated for the 2020 cost report database that was released later this summer. Next slide. So for fiscal year 22, our rates were essentially frozen, and then a 2% increase was then added to your fiscal year 21 rate. So those are effective for your rates that started in July, and then that's going to take you through June of 2022. So due to HB 110, the ICF rate formula was not run in fiscal year 22. I'm sure if you pulled down your rate packages from MITS, you would have noticed it was just a very simple 2-page document instead of the full, I don't know what it is, 13, 14 pages taking you through the calculations of the various cost centers. So we do have the average actual fiscal year 22 rates that were received by each peer group. So I don't need to read these off each individually, but peer group 1, 17 beds or greater, 357.30 per day, and then the respective rates for each peer group follow. So that's simply, again, just based on the fiscal year 21 rates calculated with a 2% increase. So looking to fiscal year 23, as currently stated in HB 110, the fiscal year 23 rates that are going to be effective starting July of next year through June of 23 are going to be returned to being calculated under the ICF formula that is in statute. So what the department is going to do is take your year-end 21 cost reports go through a typical rate setting calculation and come up with the rates that would hypothetically be distributed to each provider. So that's going to be the first step. At that point, then, they are going to compare whatever those calculated rates come out to and compare that calculated average to the statewide average that is in statute. So the statewide average in statute currently is 365.05. So the third portion of this rate calculation is if the statewide average rates hypothetically came out to, let's just say, $380 a day. Whatever percentage needs to be reduced to get the statewide average calculated down to the 365.05, that is what each provider's rate is going to be reduced by. So we have gotten some questions of concern from concerned providers. Again, hypothetically, let's say their fiscal year 23 rate after being pushed through the formula ended up being calculated to $400 a day. They're saying, oh no, if the statewide average is $370, my 400 rate is automatically going to be reduced down to 365. That is not the case. What's going to happen is your $400 hypothetical rate is only going to be reduced by, let's say, if it's 7 or 8%, that needs to be applied to all provider rates to get the statewide average rate down to 365. You're not going to just go from a $400 rate all the way down to 365. Kurt, I know you had kind of brought up yesterday in the legislative session the possibility of getting this rollback rescinded, especially with the budget right now and the ongoing nuances with the ARPA funds. Just as they mentioned yesterday, all we know at this point is what's currently in statute. So I guess we'll assume for now that this methodology will hold for now. Correct. It's going to be applied statewide. So that was not based on fiscal year 22. To be honest, I'm not positive when that exact calculation was implemented or what data point it was calculated on, but it wasn't fiscal year 22 or calendar year 20. It would be calendar year 2020 cost report data, but I know the 365 was not calculated based on that, just because they didn't even go through rate setting calculation this year. Yeah, so, and conversely too, I mean, hypothetically, right, if the statewide average for next year ended up at $364 and or $365.04, no rollback is going to be applied. So I know we'll look at some of the cost data, but it'll just because of the impact of COVID last year. I mean, especially with active treatment and some other factors, costs were all over the board. So again, we don't know what the statewide average is going to end up looking like, especially because it's going to be based on your calendar year 2021 cost report. So another factor going on with rates is the quality incentive program. So that was implemented last year before it was known that just a 2% increase was going to be given to your fiscal year 22 rates. So some providers did start attesting to the 5 quality measures on their cost report, uploading their written policies, et cetera. Unfortunately, that data was not used in rates last year. However, if you started, I guess you have a leg up for this year, but if you did not participate last year and you would like to participate for this year, policies should be written and effective by the end of the year. And then, of course, you would attest to those measures on the cost report and upload your policies. And then random on-site reviews are going to be beginning in January 2023 on the quality incentive measures. So it's obviously fluid. As we just talked about, we'll have to see what happens as it relates to the budget and the discussion, ongoing discussion with the rollback implementation. But for now, just because it is in statute, we're going to assume this is going to be the case for this or fiscal year 23. Next slide. All right, so for some of you, I'm sure the rate setting methodology and calculation is going to be some repeated information, but for those that aren't aware, we'll just go through a simple rate calculation example as OPRA asked us to do. So looking at the protected cost center, there are no ceilings under protected. Costs are fully reimbursed. And some examples include medical supplies, your utilities, property taxes, and then any allocated home office protected costs. So no ceilings, and we'll also see in a second your bed tax or franchise fee is also included in the protected rate. So looking at bed tax or franchise fee that is included under the protected cost center, it's currently paid on an actual inpatient day basis. So we do have the breakdowns here and the time periods of what the rate has been. So from January of 20 through June of 20, obviously we're talking about last year, it was $23.95 a day. Starting in July of last year, that increased to $24.89 a day, and that took us through June of this year. Then looking forward for fiscal year 23, or I'm sorry, fiscal year 22 and fiscal year 23, you're still going to be paying $24.89 a day, and the bed tax rate is not set to increase as of now all the way through 6/30 of 2023. So that's going to hold static at $24.89 a day. So I know typically it has changed every 6-month interval within the fiscal year, but as it relates to the state budget right now and the rate methodology, we are going to be holding at the $24.89 for the next year and a half or so. Looking at the direct care ceilings, below is a summary of what the direct care ceilings have been. We're showing fiscal year 20 and fiscal year 21 and the dollar change and percent change. We don't know, or we don't have fiscal year 23 ceilings just because, or I'm sorry, fiscal year 22 ceilings just because they were not calculated or reset as part of the fiscal rates this year. So these are the most current rate, the most current ceilings that have been implemented and used as part of rate setting. And then we are going to have the continuation, of course, of the DDP tool just to measure acuity for all the individuals. And we'll see that in a second, how that factors into the direct care rate calculation. Looking at the indirect care side, we're also showing the indirect care ceilings on top. Also just showing fiscal year 20 and 21 as 22 ceilings were not reset, and then the respective indirect care efficiency incentives for each peer group. We, again, will see how these ceilings were used in a hypothetical rate calculation example, but no reset. I know there has been discussion about the request of DODD to hypothetically go through a fiscal year 22 rate setting to see what the figures would have ended up looking like and what the potential ceilings would have been set at, just to see what their baseline would have been had the ceilings been implemented and used as part of fiscal year 22 rates, even though, of course, they weren't reset and they weren't used. But just to get an idea, especially as we look forward to fiscal year 23 when the rate formula will be re-implemented. So we talked about protected, direct, and indirect. The last portion is capital, which of course was kind of overhauled 4 years ago from cost-based reimbursed to the fair rental value methodology, which is much more complicated than the old calculation. But the capital portion is is calculated under the fair rental value methodology, where some of the portion of the calculation is run through the FRV formula, but equipment is still cost-based reimbursed. And then we are showing a number of the factors that go into the FRV calculation. We'll look at these in a second here, but some of them being the RS means construction index based on the respective peer group, whether you're using the nursing home or assisted living index, the age of your facility, the square footage of your facility, overall rate caps, and then any secondary building calculations as it relates to home office or any square footage that you have on that side of things. So now your depreciation is 20,000 a year. Yeah. I think that's a great question. We'll look in a second here what the equipment caps are for each peer group. And then, as it relates to your situation, I'm sure you're going to be double, if not triple, maybe, because you're just talking about your van, and you're not even considering any of your other equipment either. So, yeah. Slide. Next slide. So really the top of the FRV calculation starts with what they call the RS means construction index. That is used to calculate the value per square feet. So for peer group 1 and peer group 2, 17 beds and or 9 to 16 beds, you guys are using the assisted living index, which is a base rate of 187.43. And then for peer groups 3 and 4, anywhere from 4 to 8 beds, you are using the nursing home index with a base rate of 215.71. Then what happens is that base rate is then applied against the county modifier, whatever county you fall in. So hypothetically, if you are in peer group 4, you have a base rate of 215.71. And you fall in, I'll use Franklin County since we're there, and you have a modifier of 0.91. So your 215.71 is going to be multiplied by 0.91. So you're not truly getting the whole 215.71 base rate. You're getting your 215.71 multiplied out by 0.91 to get your specific base rate that is then multiplied out against your beds. Slide. Other factors in the FRV calculation are the square foot caps per peer group. So for peer group 1, you would take your facility square feet divided by the number of beds. And if that is below 550, you're going to use whatever that actual calculation is. And if you hypothetically come out to a $1,000 per bed calculation, the cap is 550. So you're going to be reduced to the 550 cap. So obviously it goes up by peer group. And then the depreciation rate, land value, rental rate, and occupancy thresholds are the same across all 4 peer groups. There are not certain caps or distinctions between each peer group. And then there is a minimum square footage that is set at 200 square feet a bed for all peer groups. So if you are below that threshold for some reason, you would then be set at $200 a square foot. Looking at the equipment side now. So equipment is cost-based as part of the calculation. We'll see how that factors in a second here. But separate of the whole FRV component, as we use the RS means index by peer group. Equipment is cost-based reimbursed. There are also caps for each peer group. So peer group 1, there is a $5 PPD cap going up to a max of $9 for peer group 4. So if your equipment PPD is, $10, $15, $20 a day, you are just going to be reimbursed at the $5 rate being in peer group 1. So we've gone through a hypothetical rate calculation, just looking at the different factors that we kind of talked through at the beginning, specifically as it relates to the fiscal year 22 and 23 rates. What I've also done, or what we've also done, is we talked through protected and direct. So we essentially have split out the active treatment portion from direct, even though it is included within the total reimbursement rate in our example. And then we've also do have the 2 lines for both indirect and the efficiency incentive. So fiscal year 21 ran through the traditional ICF rate calculation formula that is in statute. 318.77, that's based on the ceilings that were set. Also using, of course, the actual DDP score for that calendar year and the inflation factors. Under the fiscal year 22 estimated column, we have a note down here that our estimated rate is calculated using the fiscal year 21 ceilings, as that was our most current information that we had at the time. We essentially rolled those ceilings forward. And we also used the inflation factors from fiscal year 21. However, we did use in this example actual 2020 DDP scores for the direct care calculation. And we did use a provider's actual 2020 calendar year costs. So under our fiscal year 22 estimated example, using calendar year 2020 cost report data, pushing forward fiscal year 21 ceilings and inflation factors as a best estimate purpose, we would have seen a rate of potentially 371.30. Do keep in mind that also, while it did not skew the dollar amount a lot, we did, under the calculation methodology that had been in place at the time, reduce the direct care add-on by 1%, just because the 3.04% went down 1%, which that last 1% was an earmarked for the quality incentive program, even though that was not essentially implemented for the fiscal year 22 rates. Then in the last column, we're looking at fiscal year 22 actual rate that was received. So obviously we are essentially pushing forward or keeping the fiscal year 21 rate the same at 318.77. A provider got a 2% increase from that 318.77 rate, $6.38. So, and a final rate of 325.15. So you can see the impact based on estimated annual Medicaid days of 2370, which is basically rolling forward the calendar year 2019 days, a potential revenue increase of 124,000, just extrapolating the increase of fiscal year 21 rate of the 5253 under our estimated column multiplied out by the 2370 patient days. As compared to the actual fiscal year 22 rate received of 325, just due to the 2% increase, not the rate calculation push forward. So an increase of 15,000. So, looking at a $110,000 impact, just simply going to the 2% increase over the rate formula or methodology. Breaking down each cost center now, we saw the total rate for each cost center previously. So as we previously mentioned, the protected cost center includes items such as medical supplies, utilities, property tax, and home office. So what we do is we take our total cost for that cost center, which is $81,478. If we look at the top section, it's $23,000 and $679. And we essentially just divide that out by our inpatient days of 2,370 to get our per diem rates. So looking at all of our costs separate of bed tax or franchise fee, in this example, we have a per diem of $9.98. And that is multiplied out on the bottom by the inflation factor of 0.9795 to get the adjusted per diem rate after inflation of 978. And then of course, the franchise fee that is passed through that you pay $24.89 to arrive at a protected rate of $34.67. Looking at the direct side now, we kind of have this shrunk down into 4 or 5 lines here, nursing and rehab, which obviously includes a lot more than just one line. It has all of your nursing staff, contract therapies, et cetera. And then payroll taxes, fringes, and any others. So in this example, a total cost of $514,000. This is before active treatment. As I mentioned before, we kind of calculate and splice out the active treatment calculation just so we can track and see that separately. So looking at the top portion here, before active treatment, 514,949 divided by your actual census days of 2370 leaves a per diem rate of 217.28. Then looking at active treatment, we have a cost of 59,606, also divided by your 2370 patient days to get a $25.15 per diem, arriving at a total direct care calc of $242.43 a day. And we can see that that first part of the calculation on the bottom, we have line 1, our direct care cost, divided by line 4, our patient days, giving us a direct care cost per diem of $242.43. That number is then divided out by your actual DDP score for that calendar year. So in this case, 1.357 DDP, average DDP score, giving a cost per case mix unit of 178.65. This example is a 9-bed location, so peer group 2, 9 to 16 beds. So the direct care ceiling being 172.55. What happens then is the cost per case mix unit, 178.65, is compared to that ceiling. If you're above the ceiling, you're automatically adjusted down to what the actual ceiling is. So that's the case in this example, the 178 being above the 172 ceiling. And then also if you're below the ceiling, you're of course just used what or applied whatever your calculation is there. So with this example being above the ceiling is being pushed down as the allowable facility cost per case mix unit. And then that is multiplied out or multiplied back out again by the case mix score of the 1.357, getting an uninflated direct care rate of 234.15. And then the last and final step is then multiplying out the uninflated direct care rate by the direct care inflation factor of 1.0381 to view your total direct care reimbursement rate of 243.07. Sorry, go back 1 second. So obviously in this example, with the provider's direct care rate being 178 against the 172, whatever that exact difference is, the $6 a day or so that they're above the ceiling. Those are obviously dollars that this facility is not being reimbursed for. So you can extrapolate that out, $6 and some change multiplied out by the 2370. I think we went backwards, go forward 2 slides. So looking at the indirect care side is a very similar formula as compared to the direct care side, with the exception of obviously there's no DDP calculation. That's not part of indirect care. So indirect care costs include items such as dietary, medical records, HAB staff, or I'm sorry, HAB and continence supplies, A&G, maintenance, minor equipment, and of course, indirect payroll, fringes, et cetera. So in this case, total indirect care cost of $174,000. The calculation of the per diem rate on the indirect care side is a little bit different than the direct care side. So on direct care, your actual inpatient days are what is actually used as the denominator, but on the indirect care side, there is an 85% occupancy threshold, which is the case in this example as well. So a 9-bed facility at 366 days being a leap year, they were running at about 72% occupancy. So that's why you see here the inpatient days being listed at 2,800 instead of the 2,370. And we have the breakdown of the calculation at the bottom here, but just because they were below the 85% occupancy threshold, if you are below that, your denominator for inpatient days is automatically going to be adjusted to 85% of total allowable days. However, if you are above the 85% threshold, you are going to use the actual days that occurred. Yeah, so just at the bottom here, there's 3,294 total available days. However, their actual census ended up coming out to 71.95%, which of course is below the 85% occupancy threshold. So therefore, the inpatient days used on the indirect care side in this example is just the 3,294 total available days multiplied out by the 85% threshold to give us our 2,800. So using the 2,800 days divided out from our indirect care cost of 174,000 gives us a per diem rate of 62.23. That is then multiplied out by the inflation factor, 1.0099, to get us our inflated indirect care costs of 62.85. For this provider being in peer group 2, a total indirect care ceiling of 74.46. This provider is well under the indirect care ceiling, so their actual inflated per diem cost of 62.85 is used. Lastly, there is the efficiency incentive. So if a provider is below the total indirect care ceiling, the difference between their actual per diem costs and the ceiling is then applied and given as an efficiency incentive. So because they are well below the 447 efficiency incentive ceiling, they are going to get the full $4.47. So that is then just added to their actual calculation of 62.85. Hypothetically, let's say their indirect care cost per diem was $72, which is only $2.46 below the ceiling. They would just get the $72 plus the difference between the ceiling and their $72, so only $2.46, which would bring them up flush or net against the ceiling. They're not going to get the full 447. Any questions on this? Active treatment is also known as day programming. So offsite just means, you're going to or contracting with another provider. On-site may not necessarily be, at the actual ICF location, but run by your internal organization. Next slide. Next slide. Okay. The active treatment is included as part of the total direct care rate. I just mentioned as part of our example, we hypothetically could have included active treatment, and we are including active treatment as part of the total direct care per diem calculation. We just kind of split it out on our on our summary rate calculation that we saw on the kind of the overview of the total rate, we just broke it down under the direct care slide, just showing how the active treatment portion was calculated. Yeah, if the, I'm not. Yeah, I'm not sure if the question from the chat was related to waiver or not. As it relates to active treatment, yeah, that's all part of just, I'm sorry. Yeah, the only factor in terms of acuity on the direct care side is just whatever your DDP, average DDP score is for that ICF for that respective calendar year. There is no, separate acuity score component from active treatment. It's just part of the resident score in that ICF. Yeah, I can follow up with her, but again, just active treatment costs are included as part of the total direct care per diem calculation. And the only factor in terms of acuity is related to the actual ICF residents average annual DDP score. Next slide. So on the FRV or capital side, there's a lot of numbers on this page. I'm not going to go through every single line specifically. I will just touch on a few high level items that are pretty integral into the calculation. Starting in the top left, so the total facility square feet of 4585. We talked about their occupancy of 2370. The building age for this location is 21 years. That is capped at 40 years. So there's a 40-year age cap. So then looking the far right side is kind of the breakdown of the total capital rate. They have an allowable square footage calculation or allowable square feet of 4585. The value per square feet I mentioned was the base rate. In this case, the 172.44 for the value per square feet is after the county modifier being applied, giving a current asset value of $790,000. 1.6% facility depreciation rate. There's a land value of 10% and the fair rental value rate of 11%. So in this calculation, a total FRV rate of $22.58. We then also have the secondary building calculation for any home office. So in this scenario, $1.45 a day. And then lastly, the equipment PPD calculation. So in this scenario, similar to you, a $6.62 PPD, which isn't substantially over the cap of $6.50. So there is just an allowable PPD here of $6.50 since they are over the cap. Yeah, I'm not sure specifically. I know they do. I think the last time they do adjust the base RS means amount. I can't remember a year or two before these, but the base was 215 in this example. I think the previous fiscal, it was around, I want to say 208, 207. So it is continuing to be adjusted and looked at. So I would imagine They will be adjusted again, especially for fiscal year 23 rates once the full rate calculation is re-implemented. You know, I can't say it's going to go from 215 to 240, but I'm sure there will be some adjustment there. Correct. Right now, it's just the caps that have been in place since FRV was implemented 4 years ago. The caps have not been adjusted. So adding the FRV rate 2258, secondary building add-on, and then the equipment PPD gives us a total FRV rate of $30.54. That's kind of step one. The next step is then looking at the actual PPD calculation for this location. So they did have 45,000 of total capital costs. We then divide that out by their occupancy of 2370, which gives them a actual PPD of $14.92. That actual PPD of $14.92 is compared to the total FRV rate of $30.54 that we previously went through. So they are under the total FRV rate by $15.62. Because they are under the FRV rate, there are allowable dollar increases by peer group. So for peer group 3, if you are under the FRV rate, you are given a $3 increase per day. And then lastly is the surplus calculation. So we take the 1562 less the allowable dollar increase to give us a surplus of $12.62. And the retained surplus that you're given is 10% of any surplus. So in this scenario, we have our 1492 of our actual capital PPD since we're under the FRV rate. If you are over the FRV rate, you're going to get the FRV rate. But in this scenario, 1492 for the actual capital PPD, $3 allowable dollar increase, and then the 126 for the retained surplus for a total rate of 1918. So there are also other calculations that are not even on the screen, considering your improvements that you do. That's also reported on the cost report on attachment 9. So if you have a roof replacement, if you have a new AC, HVAC unit, anything like that, that's also factored in here, and is included kind of on the lower left calculations in terms of calculating any new bed equivalent calculations. Next slide. So that was kind of the just rundown or breakdown of the actual ICF rate calculation. I know there's a lot of different nuances, but I guess before we go into any high level trends here, are there any other questions? The secondary building calculation. So essentially what you do is you report on attachment 9, page 2 of the cost report, your home office square footage. And then there is a section or cell essentially where you report the percentage of costs. So that's where any costs would be captured. So if they did a renovation, I'm sure they're capturing depreciation costs as part of that. And then whatever that factor ends up being as a percentage of total is where they would then adjust yearly whatever that particular ICF or home office percentage ended up being. So lastly here, we've just taken some trends based on the calendar year 2020 cost report data. We have 4 or 5 years trailing here for a number of different slides. So I won't read every single number on here. We have about 10 or 15 trends we're looking at. But this first graph here is just the provider count by peer group. So if we just look at 2020, there were 132 providers for 4 to 6 beds, 187 for 7 to 8 beds, et cetera. Next slide. Total beds by year. I'm not sure for you in the room here, it's if you can quite decipher the key. But orange at the bottom is 4 to 6 beds. So peer group 4. Yellow 7 to 8 beds. Peer group 3. Teal 9 to 16 beds. So we can clearly see a trend here of decreasing beds. 5,676 in 2016. And we're down to 4,800 now in 2020. Sorry. So just how the percentages and the counts are working. If we look at 2020, in blue is 17 beds or greater, peer group 1. So they account for 2,069 beds of the total 4,802. They do. It's the very thin gray line at the top. It's essentially peer group 5. Yeah. Next slide. Median occupancies by peer group. So for peer group 4 and peer group 2, relatively flat from 19 to 20, looking at the orange and teal line. For peer group 7 to 8 beds, as well as peer group 1, 17 or greater, there was a slight reduction there, as well as the DCs or peer group 5 in gray. Slide. That I'm sure the shift to waiver, there's a lot of factors of occupancy challenges, people just rescinding beds. Yeah. Change in percent occupancy. So in this, we're just looking at what percentage certain facilities were at in terms of their occupancy. So in 2020, there were only 37% that were carrying a 99 to 100% occupancy in their facility. There were 27% of providers that were looking at or carrying occupancy that was 90% or less. So in terms of 19 to 20, relatively flat, a little bit of an increase for 99 to 100% occupancy, and then also an increase of occupancy that was below 90% from 23% of providers to 27% that saw an occupancy of 90% or less total across their location. This is just grand total costs by cost center. We have a number of years trailing here, but there was, for example, $60 million in total protected costs in 2020, 318 million across the entire state for direct care. And then you can see the rest of the cost centers. So certainly an increase across every cost center except for active treatment. You can obviously see the big impact there from 67 million in 2019 across the state down to 42 million. This is just looking at benefits as a percent of wages across all cost centers, direct, indirect, et cetera. Just using an example, peer group 4, which is 4 to 6 beds total. Benefits, payroll, fringe, workers' comp as a percent was 17.8. 17.9 for peer group 7 to 8, and then the remaining respective peer groups. So I think we're seeing a decrease here just as a result of some staffing challenges. Obviously, fringes will decrease as wages decrease. I think we did see a decrease across all peer groups from 2019 to 2020 as a result of that. Just trending payroll, fringe, and workers' comp analysis again. Grand total average benefits as a percent of wages in 2020 was 20%. We did see previously there were some peer groups in the 17-18% range. However, you know, there were some in the low 20s as we looked into peer group 2 and peer group 1. And then we just have the total cost by year. So 23 million for payroll, fringe, workers' comp in 2020. Or for payroll costs, 23 mil, fringe benefits 32, and then workers' comp 5.15. Workers' comp, I know, you know, there were a lot of the rebates or redistributions. Obviously, those were not to be offset on the cost report. They were to be left in other revenue essentially. So those dollars are not factored in here either. Excellent. I'm sorry. So it was actually in your benefit that we weren't offsetting costs, just because if we did offset. I guess it just depends on how the distribution is specifically earmarked. I haven't heard any specific guidance yet of how it is to be handled for the calendar year 2021 cost reports yet, but I know the last 2 years we have not been offsetting workers' comp expense. Total median cost per day by peer group, we can see a substantial increase to be expected from 2013 all the way through 2020. So for most peer groups, up in the $330 to, you know, mid 360s per day. These are just breaking down the median cost per day by each peer group. Or not by each peer group, but by each cost center. So median cost per day of $35.73 across all providers for protected, $215 for direct care, et cetera. So certainly increasing pretty much every year for the last 5 years. Active treatment cost per day, which is where we see the biggest impact, looking at 19 to 20. So you can see, you know, there was 32 providers in 2019 that had active treatment costs per day of $60 to $70, 67 providers, 89 providers with costs per day of 50 to 60 and 40 to 50 respectively. So we can see the huge drop in cost per day and the number of providers at 0 or near the bottom. So we had 11 providers with cost per day of 0 to 9 and 19 compared to 106 providers in 2020, just simply due to the impact of COVID and the shutting down of day programs. Yeah. Could you go back one slide, please? I think it was a few. Yeah, it was a few slides back. It is including that. I think we saw, if you go back a few slides, if you could please. One more. Keep going. Right here. So if we just look at direct care, we went from 279 to 318 million. And then you do see we also break out active treatments separately. So we went from 67 million down to 42 million. yeah, so 25 million decrease there in active treatment, which is then correlated to the number of providers dropping down to the low ranges per day. Yeah, I think there's, I mean, I'm just hypothesizing here. I'm guessing there's going to be, it's going to be interesting to see with a few factors, active treatment or day programming is ramping back up, but also certain providers having staffing challenges too. So maybe their active treatment costs are up a lot, but potentially their wages may be flat or potentially even lower. So. And then meeting active treatment as a percent of total costs. So again, huge decrease, as you can see in 2020, just due to all the factors that we discussed around active treatment. So that's all of the trends that we have. Of course, feel free to reach out if you have any questions. We're here to help, here to answer anything. You can certainly pass around our white paper that has these trends on it if you'd like. So yeah, anytime we're open for questions. Yeah, I mean, if you know your home office square footage is legitimate, you certainly report your actual home office square footage on attachment 9. It's paid attachment 9, page 2 on the cost report. So if you went from 5,000 in 2019 to or 2020 to 6,000 2021, they can certainly report that, and then also corresponding to that, adjust that particular ICF's percentage as a percent of total cost as well. That's it. All right. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for your time.
Yeah.